I never thought I'd be the person being escorted out of a gym by security while parents filmed me on their phones like I was some kind of public menace, but that's exactly where I found myself last Tuesday, clutching my gym bag and shaking with a mix of rage and pure, unadulterated humiliation. All I wanted to do was a back walkover, something I've practiced in my backyard until my grass turned into a literal dirt path, but apparently, according to the head coach at Elite Peak Athletics, my body is a liability, and my presence is distracting to the serious athletes. He actually looked me in the eyes and told me that the equipment wasn't rated for people of my build, even though I know for a fact those bars can hold the weight of a grown man. I've spent my whole life being told to take up space, to be confident, and to chase my dreams, but the second I actually tried to do it in a leotard, the world tried to slam the door in my face. Was I wrong for refusing to leave until he admitted his policy was actually just blatant discrimination? Or would you have just walked away quietly to save yourself the embarrassment? I really need you to tell me if I'm the one who went too far here, because right now, I feel like I'm losing my mind. To understand how I ended up being the problem child of a suburban gymnastics center at 23 years old, you have to understand that I've been a big girl my entire life. I wasn't just the tall kid, I was the sturdy kid, the one who was always picked last for dodgeball but was secretly flexible as a rubber band. I grew up in a house where my mom was a former track star, and my dad was a literal mountain of a man who played D1 football. Fitness was always around me, but so was the pressure to look a certain way. My childhood was a series of subtle redirections. Every time I reached for a tutu or pointed at a gymnastics mat, there was a gentle suggestion to try something else. It wasn't that my parents didn't love me. They just lived in a world where big meant strong but not graceful. They saw my broad shoulders and thick legs as tools for a volleyball court or a throwing circle, never for a balance beam. I remember being 6 years old and watching the Olympics, mesmerized by the way the gymnasts flew through the air. I begged my mom to sign me up for classes, but she always nudged me toward swimming or volleyball, saying those were better suited for my frame. I didn't realize until I was much older that she was just trying to protect me from the inevitable comments people make when they see a girl who doesn't fit the pixie mold trying to be graceful. The psychological weight of that protection was heavy. It taught me that my body was a problem to be managed rather than a gift to be celebrated. Throughout middle school, I'd hide in the library during lunch to avoid the judgmental gaze of the fit girls. I'd wear oversized hoodies even in the peak of summer, sweating buckets just to hide the outline of my curves. By the time I hit college, I had mastered the art of being invisible. I was the funny friend, the smart friend, the one who was always ready with a witty comeback, but never the one who was ready to jump into a pool. But even in that darkness, there was a flicker of rebellion. I started taking yoga in the privacy of my dorm room. I found that my bulky legs were incredibly powerful anchors and my wide shoulders could hold a headstand for minutes. I began to realize that the industry standards for what an athlete looks like were narrow, shallow, and frankly boring. I pushed that dream down deep for years. I went through high school, I went to college, and I built a successful career in graphic design. But that itch never went away. Every time I saw a gymnastics video on my feed, my heart would ache. I would spend hours scrolling through specialized accounts of adult gymnasts, feeling a burning envy for their courage. I saw women of all shapes and sizes reclaiming their childhood dreams. And a voice inside me started getting louder. It said, "Why not you?" About 6 months ago, I decided I was done living for other people's comfort levels. I started training at home. I bought mats, I watched thousands of hours of tutorials, and I realized that despite being a size 18, my core strength was insane, and my flexibility was better than most of the teenagers I saw online. I spent hours in my garage, sweating through my clothes, failing at handstands over and over until my wrists throbbed. I remember the first time I kicked up against the wall and didn't fall. I cried. Not a sad cry, but a holy crap, I'm actually doing this cry. I taught myself a handstand, then a cartwheel, then a round-off. I felt powerful. I felt like I was finally inhabiting my own skin. That's when I decided it was time for professional coaching. I didn't want to just be good for my size. I wanted to be actually good. I wanted to feel the chalk on my hands and the bounce of a real spring floor. I did my research and found Elite Peak Athletics. Their website bragged about inclusive training for all levels and backgrounds. And their Instagram was full of girl power, hashtags and photos of diverse women. It felt like a sign. I called them up and spoke to a receptionist named Sarah who seemed lovely. I told her I was an adult beginner with some self-taught experience and wanted to join their evening adult tumbling class. She signed me up, took my deposit, and told me she'd see me on Tuesday. She sounded genuinely excited, which made me feel safe. I was so nervous I could barely eat for 2 days. I spent a week worrying about whether my leotard would ride up, or if people would stare at my cellulite. I bought a high-quality, supportive leotard and some athletic leggings, making sure I looked professional and ready to work. I stood in front of my mirror for an hour that Tuesday, practicing my "I belong here" face. When I walked into that gym for the first time, the smell of chalk and sweat felt like home, even though I'd never been there. The high ceilings and the bright lights felt like a cathedral of movement. But the second I stepped onto the blue mats, the energy shifted. The adult class was small, maybe 6 other people, all of whom were much smaller than me, wearing tiny crop tops and high-cut shorts. The coach, a guy named Marcus who looked like he lived on a diet of protein powder and Spite, stopped mid-sentence when he saw me. He didn't say hello. He just looked me up and down with this expression of pure disbelief, like I had wandered into the wrong building looking for a bakery. I tried to be friendly. I walked up, held out my hand and said, "Hi, I'm Maya. I'm here for the 7 o'clock tumbling." He didn't take my hand. He just looked at his clipboard and then back at me, clearing his throat in that way people do when they're about to say something incredibly rude but want to frame it as concern. He told me there must have been a mistake, and that Sarah shouldn't have processed my registration without a physical assessment. I told him I was healthy, active, and had been training at home, but he just shook his head. He told me to wait in the lobby while he checked the equipment specs. I sat on those hard plastic chairs for 20 minutes, watching the other girls, most of whom were half my size and struggling with basic handstands, while Marcus whispered to another coach and pointed at me. I could see them glancing at my thighs, then at the bars, then back at me with a smirk. They weren't even trying to be subtle. It was high school all over again, only this time I was paying for the privilege of being bullied. When he finally called me back into his office, he didn't even sit down. He told me that for safety reasons, he couldn't allow me on the trampolines or the high-impact mats. He said the springs were calibrated for a certain weight limit, and that if I were to get injured, the insurance wouldn't cover it because I was outside the standard operating parameters. I felt like he was talking about a piece of freight, not a human being. I asked him what that limit was, because I knew for a fact that male gymnasts, who are often incredibly muscular and heavy, use those same mats. He couldn't give me a number. He just kept using words like bulk and density. He even had the audacity to suggest I try a water aerobics class at the local Y instead. I told him I wasn't leaving. I told him I paid my deposit and I was going to participate in the class I signed up for. I walked out of his office, went back to the floor, and started my warm-up. I did a perfect split right in front of him, and I could see the flash of annoyance in his eyes because I wasn't the clumsy big girl he wanted me to be. The class started, and I kept up with every single drill. In fact, I was doing better than a few of the girls who were clearly there just for the aesthetic of being a gymnast. But every time it was my turn to use the tumble track, Marcus would step in front of me and tell me to stick to the floor exercises. It was so performative, so obviously meant to shame me in front of the others. He would make comments about protecting the floor and impact noise. The other students were starting to whisper. I could feel their eyes on my back, some with pity, some with that same, "You don't belong here" smirk. There was this one girl, Jessica, who kept giggling every time I did a tuck jump. She looked at her friend and whispered something about earthquakes. I heard it, and Marcus heard it too, but he didn't say a word to her. He just kept glaring at me, waiting for me to fail. But I didn't fail. I nailed every landing. I was more controlled than anyone else in that room because I had to be. I knew any mistake I made would be blamed on my weight, not my technique. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I was pushing myself harder than I ever had, fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and pure spite. Every muscle in my body was screaming, but I refused to show weakness. I kept my head high, my toes pointed, and my form impeccable. Marcus was getting more and more frustrated as the minutes ticked by. He was looking for any excuse to throw me out, any slight stumble or labored breath he could use to justify his safety concerns. But I gave him nothing. I was a machine. I was proof that his narrow definition of an athlete was a lie. So, before I tell you how this whole thing exploded and why the police ended up being called, I want you to stop right now. Seriously, pause the video and go to the comments. If you were in a position where you were being told you couldn't do your passion solely because of how you looked, despite having the skill to back it up, would you have stayed and fought like I did? Or would you have left to avoid the scene? I need to know if I was being brave or just stubborn. The breaking point happened during the last 10 minutes of class. We were supposed to be practicing back handsprings with a spot. Now, I've been working on my snapdown and my core strength for months. I knew I was ready. When it was my turn, Marcus didn't even offer to spot me. He just crossed his arms and said, "Maya, I think it's best if you just watch this part. We don't have a spotter trained for your center of gravity." That was it. That was the line. It wasn't about safety. It was about the fact that he didn't want to touch me, didn't want to help me, and didn't think I was worth the effort. He treated me like I was a different species. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I don't need a spot. I can do it myself." He laughed. An actual, condescending chuckle that echoed off the gym walls. He told me if I attempted a high-impact move like that on his floor and broke the equipment or myself, he'd sue me for damages. He even signaled for the other girls to step back, as if I was about to cause some kind of structural collapse. I didn't say another word. I walked to the start of the mat, took a deep breath, and focused everything I had. I could hear my own heart thumping in my ears. I pictured every video I'd ever watched, every hour in my garage, every time someone told me no. I ran, I hit the round off with explosive power, and I launched into a perfect back handspring. I stuck the landing so hard the mats barely made a sound. The gym went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on those mats. Jessica's mouth was literally hanging open. The other coach, the one who had been smirking earlier, looked like he had seen a ghost. I looked at Marcus, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement, maybe even an apology. Instead, he turned bright red. His neck veins were popping out, and he looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. He didn't care that I was capable. He cared that I had challenged his authority and proven him wrong in front of his paying customers. He felt humiliated that the girl he tried to bench was the only one who had mastered the move perfectly. He shouted at me to get out. He said I was trespassing, and that he was canceling my membership effective immediately for insubordination. He was screaming so loud that parents from the lobby started coming to the glass to see what was happening. I refused to move. I told him I wanted a full refund on the spot, and a written statement as to why I was being kicked out. I wanted him to put his discrimination in writing. He lost it. He started yelling about how people like me are ruining the sport and how this wasn't a body positivity camp. He told me that gymnastics was for athletes, and that I was making a mockery of the discipline. He called the front desk and told them to call the non-emergency police line because a disturbed individual was refusing to leave the premises. While we waited for the police, I stayed right there on the mat. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I asked him to repeat what he said about the equipment specs and my build. He clammed up once the camera was on him, but the damage was done. I turned the camera around and showed the class, showed the mats, and explained exactly what he had said to me. One of the other moms in the lobby, who I later found out had a daughter in the competitive program, actually started nodding and filming too. She shouted through the glass, "He says that stuff to the kids too, Maya. Don't back down." That gave me the second wind I needed. I stood my ground for 15 minutes while Marcus paced like a caged animal, refusing to even look at me. When the police arrived, they were actually pretty embarrassed for him. 2 officers walked in, looking at Marcus, who was sweating and shouting, and then at me, just standing there in my gear with my phone out. They told me that while the gym is a private business, and they have the right to ask anyone to leave, I hadn't actually committed a crime. They escorted me out just to de-escalate the situation. But the officer who walked me to my car actually whispered that he thought the coach was a grade A jerk, and told me I had a great back handspring. He said his daughter does gymnastics and he's never seen a coach act like that. I sat in my car and cried for an hour. Not because I was ashamed, but because I was so incredibly angry that I had to fight that hard just to be allowed to exist in a space I paid for. I felt like the world was telling me that my hard work didn't matter because of the size of my pants. But then I looked at my phone. I saw the video. I saw the fear in Marcus's eyes when he realized I wasn't going to be a victim. The aftermath was a whirlwind. I didn't just let it go. I posted the video I took, along with a detailed account of what happened, on my local community Facebook group and TikTok. I didn't expect much, but the internet has a way of finding the truth. Within 24 hours, it had over 50,000 views. By the third day, it was at 500,000. It turns out, I wasn't the only one Marcus had treated this way. Several former students came forward talking about the toxic weight-shaming culture at elite peak athletics. They had a weigh-in Friday for teenage girls that had caused at least 3 girls I know of to develop eating disorders. One girl messaged me saying she quit gymnastics entirely because Marcus told her she was getting too thick in the waist when she hit puberty. She was 12. Another woman told me she was denied a job as an instructor there despite having a decade of experience because she didn't have the elite peak look. The backlash was massive and beautiful. The gym's Yelp rating plummeted to 1 star overnight. Parents started pulling their kids out of classes in droves. There were literal protests in the parking lot with signs saying, "Athletes come in all sizes." About a week later, the owner of the franchise, not Marcus, but the guy who actually owns the building and the brand, reached out to me. He was terrified of a lawsuit and the PR nightmare I had created. He offered me a full refund, a public apology, and told me that Marcus had been placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation into his coaching methods. They ended up firing him 3 days later after more parents came forward with stories of verbal abuse and discriminatory practices. They even revamped their entire mission statement and hired a diversity consultant. I didn't take the refund. I told him to donate it to a local charity that provides sports equipment for underprivileged kids and body-positive coaching. I didn't want their money, I wanted their change. I found a new gym 3 towns over. It's a bit of a drive, but the coaches there didn't even blink when I walked in. They just asked me what my goals were and told me to get to work. They treat me like an athlete, not a liability. They actually cheered when I showed them my back handspring. I'm currently training for my first amateur competition, and I've never felt stronger. I'm learning to use the bars now. And guess what? They haven't snapped in half yet. I'm even working on a beam routine. Every time I stick a landing, I think of Marcus and I smile, knowing that I am exactly where I belong. I've started an Instagram page to document my journey, and the community of plus-size gymnasts I've found is the most supportive group of people I've ever known. We share tips on high-impact sports bras, and talk about how to overcome the mental blocks that come with being told we don't fit. I'm not just doing this for me anymore. I'm doing it for every little girl who was told to try volleyball instead of the bars. The moral of this story is that some people will try to project their own insecurities and narrow-mindedness onto you. But their limitations are not your own. Your body is a tool for your life, not a decoration for theirs. You are allowed to take up space, you are allowed to be loud, and you are allowed to be graceful on your own terms. If I had listened to Marcus, I would be sitting on my couch right now, feeling ashamed of a body that is capable of incredible things. Instead, I'm flying. Like this video if you think I handled that situation the right way, and if you're on my side against coaches like Marcus. Make sure to subscribe for more stories where we stand up to the people who try to keep us small. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been told you couldn't do something because of your appearance? Did you fight back, or did you find a new path? Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section below. And let's start a conversation. Your stories give me strength, and I hope mine gives you some too. I'll see you all in the next story.